Welcome to this deep dive
Oh, cool.
where we're going to explore a fascinating and frankly kind of unsettling intersection. Spirituality, intellectual property, and the dynamics of cults.
Sounds intense.
Yeah, get ready to unpack some seriously thought-provoking stuff.
And you've provided us with quite the mix of source material, academic papers, what looks like a leaked internal document, and even a whole bunch of Facebook links.
It's like a digital detective's dream. And we're going to use these clues to investigate a group called Iwas-T Misja Daitani Sif Chaitanya Mission.
What's particularly interesting is how this deep dive touches on something you probably encounter every day: the ownership of ideas.
Okay.
One of the papers uses this analogy about spiritual communities being like a big pot of soup.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The author argues that if you toss in a bunch of bad ingredients, you're not going to end up with a healthy, nourishing soup, right?
Right.
In the same way, if the underlying system of a spiritual community is flawed, it can't produce genuine spiritual growth.
So even if people are attracted to the idea of the soup, the system itself might be what's spoiling the whole thing.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And that leads to another point the author makes. In a truly spiritual soup, everyone benefits, regardless of their level of advancement or understanding.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, this is where things get a bit darker.
Okay.
Some of the sources allege that certain groups, while presenting themselves as promoting spiritual goals or bhakti, are actually exploiting their members for financial gain.
Yeah, and they do this by manipulating deeply held beliefs and desires for spiritual connection.
I see.
For example, one of the accusations is that these groups demand money from their members for vague or unspecified purposes, often using tactics that raise ethical questions.
So they're basically using people's sincere desire for spiritual progress to line their own pockets.
That's one interpretation, yes.
Wow.
And it's not just about money.
Okay.
The sources also suggest that these groups pressure their members, especially artists and creators, to hand over their work with little or no compensation.
Oh, that's awful.
Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a creative project, only to have it taken and exploited by the very community you trusted.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's all carefully designed to keep people trapped.
Right.
One of the sources even mentions contracts with harsh penalties aimed at silencing dissent.
Really?
Yeah, if you speak out, you face serious consequences.
That's scary.
Yeah, a key takeaway here is we see this pattern of control repeating throughout the sources. This quote from one of the Polish language documents paints a pretty vivid picture. Biznesmeni zmuszani dubi odpowiedzialności za postupy po projektach robotniczych do pracy fizycznej nawet sekty. Często nie związane ze służby oddania. Koreacja opisywana proces z pisma.
Even without speaking Polish, you can sense the layers of exploitation they're describing.
Yeah, this is making me think about times I've felt pressured to contribute to a cause, even when something felt a bit off.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a feeling many of us have encountered.
Right.
And this brings us to the fascinating tension between intellectual property and spiritual knowledge.
Okay.
Think about it. Some of these groups are claiming copyright protection for their materials, even while arguing that spiritual knowledge should be shared freely.
It seems like a total contradiction.
Yeah.
One minute they're saying spiritual wisdom is a gift from a higher power, and the next they're slapping copyright notices on everything.
Right.
One of the sources actually uses the phrase "Kroneni majot koimi prawami autorskimi Wiedzy, knock doctrine."
What is Czaitanii na mieszku? What do you think that means?
Essentially, it's arguing that using intellectual property laws to protect spiritual teachings is inappropriate or out of place.
I see.
To understand why, we need to look at the concept of sampradesha, which refers to a lineage of spiritual teachers.
Okay.
In this tradition, knowledge is seen as a divine gift, passed down from teacher to student for generations.
So it's not something you own or control, but something you receive and share.
Exactly.
Got it.
And that's where the contrast with the open source movement comes in. Interesting.
Think about creators who freely share their software, art, or music using licenses like Creative Commons.
Right.
It's a similar idea.
Yeah.
Knowledge and creativity should be accessible to all.
The sources even point out that some big names in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, were reportedly against the idea of copyrighting spiritual teachings.
Oh, wow.
And there's this great story in Jaiva Dharma about A devotee asking if it's okay to accept payment for reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam.
Yeah.
The answer emphasizes that spiritual knowledge is meant to be shared freely.
That makes sense.
This whole section really got me thinking, who does own knowledge? And is it ever right to profit from spiritual teachings?
It's a complex question for sure.
It is.
But let's shift gears a bit and focus on the specific group mentioned in those Facts About Sifawat Chaitanya Mission documents. I Wat Misha Chaitani Sif Chaitanya Mission, led by Chris Butler. Just a heads up, these documents seem to be internal talking points compiled by ex-members, so we're going to present the information as neutrally as possible.
Right. We're not here to jump to conclusions.
Right.
You, the listener, can form your own opinions based on the information we're presenting.
Exactly.
So what are some of the key accusations?
Well, the documents allege that the group is engaged in financial exploitation.
Okay.
Members are apparently pressured to donate large sums of money, sometimes up to 50% of their income.
Wow.
And there are claims of property sales intended for temples with little transparency about where the funds went.
If true, that's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
What else do the documents reveal?
They also suggest a hidden caste system within the group, creating a rigid hierarchy that dictates how members are treated and what opportunities they have. And it gets even more disturbing. The documents accuse the group of using manipulative techniques like love bombing, NLP, gaslighting, and guilt tripping to control members.
It's like they're taking advantage of people's vulnerability and desire to belong. And to make matters worse, the sources suggest that any dissent or critical thinking is completely shut down.
Wow.
Members are forbidden from criticizing the leader, access to outside information is limited, and contact with ex-members is strictly prohibited.
This pattern of isolating members and controlling the narrative is something we see time and again in groups exhibiting cult-like behavior.
Right.
And it can have serious consequences.
I bet.
The documents even allege cases of spiritual abuse, with claims of public humiliation, degradation, and psychological pressure leading to health problems and emotional distress for members.
That's incredibly disturbing.
It is.
It really makes you wonder what goes on behind closed doors.
And speaking of things hidden from view, one detail that stood out to me was the group's reported preparation for the Y2K problem back in the late 1990s.
Oh, wow. That takes me back.
Right.
But what does that have to do with anything?
It not only helps to date the group's activities, but also provides a glimpse into their mindset. The fact that they were preparing for a potential global catastrophe speaks to a certain apocalyptic worldview,
Right.
which can be a powerful tool for controlling people's behavior.
That's a really insightful connection.
Thank
I
you.
hadn't even considered that angle.
Yeah.
And here's another piece. The sources mention that the group's chanting practices are quite unusual.
Oh, really?
They only use a few specific mantras and don't utilize traditional Indian melodies.
That's interesting.
It makes you wonder if they're deliberately trying to set themselves apart from other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups, or maybe blending different traditions in a unique way.
It's definitely something that warrants further exploration.
It is.
But for you listening, this case study raises some important questions. Have you ever encountered a group that claimed to have exclusive access to truth?
Oh, yeah.
What were the red flags that stood out to you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
We'll delve deeper into those signs in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we've just uncovered some pretty concerning accusations about IWOT Mr. Czaitanii, Sif Chaitanya Mission.
Right.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a closer look at that document titled The Confidential, Unwritten, Perverted, and Mafia Rules of chrisbutler.pdf.
Okay.
Just the name alone is enough to raise eyebrows, right?
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And if this document is authentic, it provides a chilling glimpse into how the group operates.
Uh-huh.
It reads like a list of rules designed to keep members in line
Right.
and ensure absolute obedience to Chris Butler.
And some of these rules are just plain creepy.
Yeah.
They're not just guidelines for spiritual practice, but they dictate everything from how members should run their businesses to who they can associate with.
It's very controlling.
Yeah, and the consequences for breaking these rules are pretty severe.
Like what?
Well, one thing that really struck me was the rule about treating ex-members as if they no longer exist.
Oh, wow.
Imagine being told to cut off contact with your own family just because they left the group.
That's awful.
It's a level of control that's hard to fathom.
It is.
And it's not just about silencing dissent within the group.
Okay.
There are also rules forbidding members from accessing outside information, especially anything critical of Chris Butler or the organization.
So it's like they're trying to create their own little reality bubble.
Yeah.
Completely cut off from the outside world.
Exactly.
This isolation from external viewpoints is a classic cult tactic.
Right.
But controlling the flow of information, they can shape how members perceive the world and reinforce their own ideology.
It makes sense.
Think about it.
Yeah.
If you're constantly being told that the outside world is dangerous and corrupt, and that only this group has the answers,
Right.
it's easy to see how people can become indoctrinated.
It makes you wonder if this information control ties back to those unusual chanting practices we talked about earlier.
Oh, how so?
Well, by limiting the mantras and altering the melodies, they're further isolating their members from the broader Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. It's like they're creating their own unique brand of spirituality that only they control.
That's an astute observation.
Thanks.
It's all about reinforcing their own authority and creating a sense of dependence on the group.
And this control extends to almost every aspect of their lives.
Really?
The documents allege that members are required to disclose personal and financial information, prioritize the group above all else, and view Chris Butler as the ultimate source of truth.
So it's starting to sound less like a spiritual community and more like, well, a cult.
Right, but isn't there a fine line between a spiritual group with strict rules and an actual cult?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How do we know when that line has been crossed?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But one key indicator is the degree of control the group exerts over its members' lives.
I see.
When a group starts dictating every aspect of your existence, from who you can talk to what you can read, to how you spend your money,
Yeah.
that's a huge red flag.
And what about the leader's role? Does that play a factor in determining whether a group is a cult?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Cult leaders often exhibit narcissistic tendencies, claiming to have special knowledge or a direct connection to a higher power. They demand absolute obedience and use manipulation and coercion to maintain their authority.
And according to the sources, that seems to fit the description of Chris Butler pretty well.
Really? In what way?
There's even a mention of a time when he claimed to be the Jagat Guru, which basically means the guru of the whole world.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
And it's a classic example of a cult leader attempting to elevate themselves and solidify their control over followers. By claiming universal authority, they're essentially saying that they have the answers to all of life's questions.
Right.
And that everyone else is wrong.
But here's where it gets a little strange.
Okay.
Even though Butler claimed to be the Jagat Guru, he didn't actually travel or interact directly with followers in different parts of the world. Instead, he relied on appointed overseers to act as intermediaries, even for initiations.
That seems a bit odd.
It does, and it creates a further layer of separation between the leader and the followers.
I see.
These intermediaries become the gatekeepers, controlling the flow of information and reinforcing the leader's authority.
So it's like a pyramid scheme of spiritual power with Butler at the very top.
Exactly. And speaking of pyramids, those overseers were each assigned their own zones of influence.
Oh, really?
Sort of like the zone guru system that was so controversial in ISKCon.
Right.
It seems like they're taking elements from different traditions and adapting them to suit their own purposes.
That's a really insightful point.
Thanks.
They're cherry-picking practices and doctrines, creating their own unique blend of beliefs that reinforces their control over their followers.
And it's not just about borrowing elements from other groups.
What else?
The sources also allege that Wiedzy Misa Czaitanii is of Czaitania mission, actively targets and harasses other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups. They spread misinformation and launch online attacks, seemingly attempting to discredit anyone who challenges their authority.
This behavior perfectly aligns with that cult-like tendency to demonize outsiders
Right.
and reinforce the idea that they alone possess the truth.
It's like they're saying, if you're not with us, you're against us.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty dangerous way of thinking.
It is.
And it seems like they're going to great lengths to prevent their members from questioning their teachings or seeking knowledge from other sources.
Remember how we talked about the importance of Sampradaya, the lineage of spiritual teachers?
Yes.
Well, according to the sources, Mischa Czaitanii Sif Czaitania mission actually discourages their members from studying advanced scriptural texts and engaging in philosophical discussions.
Really?
They even forbid them from traveling to India to deepen their spiritual understanding.
Wow, that seems incredibly restrictive.
It is.
It's like they're afraid of their members being exposed to different perspectives or interpretations of the teaching.
It's all about maintaining control. By limiting access to information and alternative viewpoints, they can ensure that their own interpretation of the teachings remains unchallenged.
And remember that apocalyptic worldview we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, the sources allege that Chris Butler frequently warned his followers about impending disasters like pandemics and global catastrophes.
Oh, wow. So it seems like he was constantly stoking their fears, telling them that the world was on the brink of collapse.
Exactly.
That's another classic cult tactic.
It is.
By creating a sense of urgency and fear, they make their members more dependent on the group for safety and security.
It's like saying, the world is a dangerous place, but we can protect you.
Right.
Just follow our rules and you'll be safe.
Exactly. And when people are afraid, they're less likely to think critically or question authority.
And that makes them much easier to manipulate and control.
Now, remember all those Facebook links included in the source documents?
Yes.
Well, many of those posts appear to be from former members of Wiedzy Mr. Czaitanii Kali, East Chaitanya Mission. And they offer a fascinating glimpse into the lived experiences of people who were once part of this group.
You know, it takes a lot of courage to speak out against a group that you were once a part of.
It does.
Especially if you're still processing the experience and trying to rebuild your life.
Right.
What do you think motivated these former members to share their stories so publicly?
There are probably many different reasons.
Yeah?
Some might feel a sense of responsibility to warn others about the group's harmful practices.
Right.
Others might be seeking validation for their experiences or trying to make sense of what they went through.
Yeah.
And some might simply be hoping to find support in connection with other former members.
It's a powerful reminder that behind every accusation,
Yeah.
behind every rule, behind every ideology, there are real people with real stories. And those stories deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. And as we continue to explore these sources, it's important to keep in mind the human element.
Right.
These aren't just abstract concepts we're discussing. They're about real lives that have been impacted, sometimes profoundly, by this group's actions.
So as we move into the next part of this deep dive, we want to encourage you to think about your own experiences.
Okay.
Have you ever encountered a group or an individual who exhibited some of the warning signs we've discussed?
That's a good question.
And if so, how did that experience make you feel?
Yeah. How did it make you feel?
We'll dive deeper into these questions in the final part of our exploration. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from accusations of financial exploitation to manipulative control tactics. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to those Facebook posts from former members. They're really fascinating and honestly quite heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's powerful to hear those firsthand accounts, isn't it? It reminds us that we're not just dealing with abstract ideas here, but with real people whose lives have been deeply affected.
Exactly. And it's important to approach those posts with a critical eye, just like we do with any source of information. You know, we need to be aware of potential biases, consider the context, and even be on the lookout for misinformation.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to engage in critical thinking, even when we're dealing with emotionally charged topics like cult dynamics.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get swept up in the narrative, but we need to step back and carefully evaluate the evidence presented.
Speaking of evidence, that leaked document with all the unwritten rules, you know, the confidential, unwritten, perverted, and mafia rules of chrisbutler.pdf really paints a disturbing picture of how control is maintained within this group.
It does, if it is authentic. Those rules reveal a pattern of information control, social isolation, and financial dependence that aligns with classic cult tactics.
Right.
They're designed to manipulate people to make them question their own perceptions and rely solely on the group for validation and guidance.
It's like they're creating this alternate reality where Chris Butler is the ultimate authority, and any deviation from his teachings is met with swift and often harsh consequences. It's chilling to think about the impact that kind of environment can have on someone's psyche.
One thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on secrecy. Members are discouraged from discussing certain topics, especially those that might cast the group or its leader in a negative light. It's like they're living in a world where critical thinking is forbidden and only approved narratives are allowed to circulate.
And it's not just about what they can't say, it's about what they can't access. Members are actively discouraged from seeking information from outside sources, particularly anything critical of the group. They're told that the outside world is dangerous and corrupt, and that only within the confines of the group will they find truth and safety.
That kind of isolation creates an echo chamber where their beliefs are constantly reinforced, making it incredibly difficult for them to develop a more objective perspective. And that isolation extends beyond information control. Remember how we talked about the restrictions on social interactions?
Yes, members are told who they can and can't associate with, And those relationships are often monitored and controlled by the group's leadership.
Right. It's like they're trying to sever any ties that might lead members away from the group, even ties with their own family members. And it's not just about social connections. The rules even dictate how members should conduct their business affairs. Remember that rule about not competing with Chris Butler's businesses?
Oh, yeah.
It's a clear example of how financial control plays a role in maintaining their power.
It's a multi-layered system of control designed to keep members dependent and compliant. They're told what to think, who to associate with, how to spend their money, and even how to worship. And any deviation from those prescribed norms is met with swift and often severe consequences.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, it means that we need to be vigilant, we need to be aware of the warning signs of cult behavior, and we need to be willing to ask tough questions even when those questions make us uncomfortable.
You're hitting on a crucial point. We can't just blindly accept everything we're told, especially when it comes to matters of faith and spirituality. We need to engage in critical thinking, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to trust our own instincts. If something feels off, it probably is.
And remember, genuine spiritual growth should empower you, not control. You should encourage critical thinking, not blind faith. And it should respect your individuality, not erase it.
That's what's so powerful about this deep dive. It's not just about exposing the potential harm of one specific group. It's about equipping you with the tools to navigate the complexities of the world around you.
Exactly. We want to empower you to make informed decisions, to recognize the signs of manipulation, and to protect yourselves and those you love from harmful influences.
So as you continue your journey, we leave you with this: what might those hundreds of Facebook posts linked in the Facts About Czaitania Mission documents reveal about the lived experiences of those who were once part of this group? And what does it tell us about the broader phenomenon of cult dynamics in our society?
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. That's what makes us human, and that's what helps us grow.
Great advice. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
My pleasure.